This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help making their first reading in the second lesson in the Academy's Greek grammar course. Now, as you're working through these lessons, you should be continually studying and mastering the Greek alphabet and the pronunciation of the Greek alphabet. We're going to continue to learn more information about the Greek letters and their sounds and accents and breathing and all of the information that's necessary for you to really master Greek pronunciation. We'll be learning that little by little through these lessons, but you need to make sure that you invest the time and energy into continually working on learning the names of the Greek letters, being able to look at a letter and name it both in uppercase and lowercase forms, and also being able to give the sound represented by that letter. In this second lesson, we're going to study, as you can see, vowels and diphthongs in Greek. We're going to go in lesson 2 from article 4 here, down into the next page, through this chart, one article on diaresis, and then we'll end before the breathings. So articles 4 through 8 make up lesson 2 in Greek Grammar 1. So let's take a walk through these articles and make sure it's clear what they say, and I'll help you to understand exactly what you should be looking at and studying as you go through. We're looking at some of the Greek letters. We've learned in the first article that there are 24 letters in Greek, and here we're learning about the vowels. All of the letters can be divided into two groups, vowels and consonants. So there are 24 Greek letters, and here we learn that there are 7 vowels, and you've got a list here of the 7 vowels. Now, if you're studying and memorizing the names of the Greek letters, you should be able to read this list. If you can't read this list, then you really have to make sure you're working on learning the names of the Greek letters. It's also a little more challenging because they're in their lowercase forms, which sometimes can be more difficult to recognize. But we learn here there are 7 vowels, and the vowels are alpha, epsilon, eta, iota, omicron, upsilon, and omega. These are the 7 Greek vowels. Alpha, epsilon, eta, iota, omicron, upsilon, and omega. Now what we learn about these is that some of them are always short vowels, some of them are always long vowels, and some of them can be short in some words and long in other words. We have this described here for us in Article 4. So there are 7 vowels. Of these, epsilon and omicron are always short. So epsilon, the second vowel, and omicron, the 5th vowel, those 2 vowels, epsilon and omicron, are always short. It's pretty easy to remember that omicron is always short because mikron in Greek means small. So we have epsilon, which means simple e, or even quiet e, and omicron, which means small o. Not too difficult to remember. Those 2 vowels, epsilon and omicron, are always short. They take about half the time to pronounce eta and omega, which are always long. So the 2 Greek vowels which are always long are eta and omega. Now notice that these relate to each other. Eta is a long form of epsilon. So in epsilon we read e. In eta we read e. Epsilon, e. Eta, e. Eta is always long. And then for omicron, we have omega. Omicron means small o. Omega means great O. So we have the sound O, short, O for omicron. And then we have the long sound, O, O for omega. So epsilon and omicron are always short, and then their corresponding long vowels, eta and omega, are always long. The other three vowels, alpha, iota, and upsilon, are short in some syllables and long in others. So these three, alpha, iota, and upsilon, can be long or short. In some texts, you'll see them actually marked long. In others, you'll just have to know by experience whether the vowel is long or short. So make sure you understand here in Article 4 what the names are of the 7 vowels in Greek, which of them are always short, which of them are always long, and which of them can be long or short. That's what's to be learned in Article 4. Now, we've got some notes here as we get into the vowels, and some of these are pretty significant. These footnotes you never need to pay attention to. Down at the bottom of the page, under this margin line, you never need to look down in what we could call the footer or the footnotes. But these little notes, you should always just read them, even though you may not need to study them, because sometimes they just contain interesting information that you might find helpful. Or later on, you might run into a problem where you'll just remember seeing something discussed in one of the notes, and you can go back and look it up and check it out. But let's look at this note here. This is Article 4, Note A. Vowels are said to be open or close according as the mouth is more open or closed when the vowel is expressed. So some vowels are open and some vowels are close. It doesn't say closed because the mouth isn't closed, but close meaning more closed than open. Okay? So that's one thing to think about. As you learn the sounds of the vowels, ask yourself, how do I make these vowel sounds with my mouth? Is my mouth more open or is it more closed? Pay attention to those differences. That's the study of linguistics, the science of how sounds are actually formed using the organs of speech. So pay attention to how you actually make the sounds when you articulate them. In Article 5, we learn about the diphthong. The diphthong. And you see here you're given the Greek word di, which means two, and then phthongos, which means sound. So diphthongos means two sounds. A diphthong combines two vowels in one syllable. A diphthong combines two vowels in one syllable. Now, why is this important? And we'll look at the diphthongs in just a second. The reason why this is important is because generally in Greek and Latin, anytime we see a vowel, it represents a syllable. And usually the number of syllables in a word is equal to the number of vowels in that word. But a diphthong is different. A diphthong is a pair, a special pair of vowels that when we find them in a word, we don't separate them into two syllables. We read them together as one sound in one syllable. So a diphthong combines two vowels in one syllable, whereas other combinations of vowels would be divided into two syllables. So a diphthong is one syllable made up of two vowels. All right? We learn a general rule here that the second vowel of the diphthong is always iota or upsilon, and we'll see that in the examples. The second vowel is always iota or upsilon. Now the reason why that is because we can combine these two sounds because the way that our mouths move when we articulate the vowels, it's very easy for us to move from the first vowel to the second vowel, iota or upsilon. And that's why we can pronounce them in one syllable. So let's look at the actual diphthongs. You see here we read the diphthongs are, and then we've got this long list. And you'll see that each item on the list consists of two vowels. So we have alpha and iota, epsilon and iota, omicron and iota. Then we have alpha with a iota written under the vowel. We'll talk about that in a minute. We see eta with that iota written underneath, omega with the iota underneath. Then we see alpha upsilon, epsilon upsilon, omicron upsilon, eta upsilon, and upsilon iota. So these are the diphthongs in Greek. Now you have a note here that explains what those little iotas are under these vowels. That iota written small and underneath the vowel, you can see here, is called iota subscript, and subscript just means written under. So iota subscript is that little iota written under that vowel. Now the reason why it's written under the vowel is because it's not actually pronounced. So when you see these vowels with the iota written underneath, formerly the iota was actually written next to the vowel, but it stopped being pronounced and was eventually dropped from the writing. But medieval scholars, in order to mark that this isn't merely an alpha, but it originally had a iota with it, wrote the iota underneath the vowels, and that's why it's called a iota subscript. So when we read these diphthongs here with the iota subscript, we simply read the first vowel sound. So this would be read a, this would be read e, and this would be read o. We see the iota subscript written, but we don't read it. Now, you may wonder, that doesn't seem to follow the definition of a diphthong. It says a diphthong combines two vowels in one syllable. Two vowel sounds, right? Diphthongos, two sounds. But these have only one sound. And the textbook explains here that they're called improper diphthongs. They're not really the perfect examples of diphthongs, but they're still diphthongs because we do have, at least originally, we do have two vowels in one syllable. So they are diphthongs, but they're improper. We could say unusual diphthongs, okay? And just remember that what the meaning of iota subscript is. So to pronounce these diphthongs, let's just look at the pronunciation real quick. And so you know, I produced a set of videos titled How to Read Greek, and those videos are on the course lesson page. I go into all of this pronunciation in much more detail, very slowly, so it's easy to learn, but I'll quickly go over the sounds of these diphthongs just so you can hear them in this video. So we have alpha iota, and that's read together as I. And as I said, you'll notice that the alpha is further, the sound is made further back in your throat with your mouth open. And it moves, the sound moves from the back of your mouth with your throat open, or with your mouth open, to the front of your mouth with your mouth closed. I. And you can see that motion is very easy. And that's why these two vowels are pronounced as one syllable. I. Next we have epsilon iota, and we read that as a. And you'll see the same thing if you pay attention to what's going on in your mouth as you pronounce those two sounds. A. Third, we have omicron iota, which makes oi, pronounced as one syllable. We then have a with the iota subscript, a, eta with iota subscript, e, and o, omega with iota subscript. We then move to the second set of diphthongs. We have alpha upsilon, which is read as ow. And again, if you pay attention to your mouth, you'll see that the sound is made starting further back in the mouth with the mouth open, and it moves forward and closes as you make that upsilon sound. Because it's easy to make those two sounds together, that's why it forms a diphthong. So we have Au, au. Epsilon, upsilon, eu, eu. Omicron, upsilon, u, u. It's just pronounced as the sound u, u. We then have eta, upsilon, which would be eu, eu. And lastly, upsilon iota, which is pronounced we, we. So these are the Greek diphthongs. And notice at the end of this article it says all diphthongs are long. So we put these two vowel sounds together in one syllable, and anytime we do that, anytime we have a diphthong, we treat it as a long vowel. All right, so that's all for article number 5. We have a little note here, a historical note, 5a, in alpha with iota subscript, eta iota subscript, and omega iota subscript. The iota ceased to be written around 100 BC. The custom of writing the iota under the line is as late as about the 11th century. So the iota ceased to be written and was later added back in by Greek scholars as late as the 11th century. So just a historical note to provide some more information. You then have a note here about the diphthongs and the qualities of the diphthongs. This is a note that you should just read through quickly. We'll read through it in a second, but you don't have to master or memorize this at all. We read that the diphthongs a and u are either genuine or spurious. Genuine means a real diphthong. Spurious means an apparent or not a real diphthong. Genuine a and u are a combination of epsilon and iota, or omicron and upsilon, and he gives us a couple of examples. The spurious forms of these two diphthongs arise from contraction or compensatory lengthening, and we're going to learn about those things later. You can see the article numbers given in the parentheses here. So just a note about some technical details of these diphthongs, which when you're getting started you shouldn't trouble yourself with, but later on you may be curious and find that that point is explained in the grammar. So just skim through these articles and make sure you're at least familiar with what it talks about. That's what the assessment is going to ask you to do. Just give a quick summary of what's discussed in that article. Now we move on here to Article 7, and we've got this interesting diagram. It's a little strange to understand what this diagram is trying to show us. But notice we have this triangle figure, and then we've got the Greek vowels written around this figure. Iota, epsilon, and the diphthong epsilon iota, eta, long alpha, short alpha, omega, omicron, and the diphthong u. So we've got this triangle. At the top of the triangle we read open, and down at the bottom we read close. So we understand that this represents sounds that are made with an open mouth, and then as we move down, our mouth becomes more closed as we make these lower vowel sounds. So it's a diagram just to show how the different sounds are made in the mouth and how they differ from each other. It's just important for us to pay attention to how we actually make these sounds, because we're going to see that many of the rules in Greek are based simply on how easy it is for the speaker to make the sound. So sometimes spellings will change, vowels will be dropped, vowels will be joined together, and you may wonder, why in the world would they do that? How can I remember all of these changes? The answer is just think about the pronunciation, and you'll see that where a pronunciation is clumsy or it just doesn't sound pleasant, those spellings are changed to make them more pleasant. And in other places where there is a more pleasant option, sometimes that replaces a less pleasant option. That's called euphony in language. Euphony, which simply means good sound. Okay, so there's some explanation for how the sounds are pronounced in the mouth here, which will help you to understand some of the rules that explain why spellings change in Greek words. Let's just read this article. The figure of the triangle represents the relations of the vowels and spurious diphthongs to one another. So we can see the relationships of all of the vowels and the spurious diphthongs, epsilon iota and omicron upsilon. Note also this note on the right here. From long alpha, up at the top of the diagram, to iota, which is down at the bottom of the left side of this diagram, from alpha to iota, and from short alpha down to the diphthong omicron upsilon, the elevation of the tongue gradually increases. So moving from top to bottom, we not only open or close our mouth, but we raise the tongue as we move down this chart. Omega, omicron, omicron upsilon, and upsilon are accompanied by rounding the lips. Now, you don't need to get into all of these details because all this does is illustrate what's going on in your mouth when you make these sounds. So if you just practice making these sounds, and I recommend practicing in front of a mirror if you can, make these Greek sounds and simply watch your speech organs. Watch your lips, watch your teeth, watch your tongue. Think about where the sound is being made in your mouth, and this diagram will really become very simple to understand because it's just what's going on in your mouth. So if you pay attention, you'll understand this without any crazy study needed. So that's Article 7. And then lastly, we have diairesis. You see this word, diairesis. And we read, diairesis is a double dot, which is the mark of diairesis, is written over iota or upsilon when these vowels do not form a diphthong with the preceding vowel. So sometimes we may see two vowels together that normally make a diphthong. If we see two dots written over the second vowel, it means that they're not a diphthong and they should be read separately. Those two dots are called diairesis, diairesis. And you can see an example here. I don't expect you to be able to read this yet, but I'll read it. But what you see is this word, proistemi, proistemi. And if you look, you see omicron iota in the middle of the word. Normally, these two vowels would form a diphthong. And if they were a diphthong, this word would be proistemi, proistemi. 1, 2, 3 syllables, proistemi. But this diairesis above the iota tells us that this is not to be read as a diphthong, but as two separate syllables. So we read proistemi, proistemi, 1, 2, 3, 4 syllables, not 3. So that's an example of diairesis. Okay? And here's another example. We have the Greek letter nu, eta, and iota marked by diairesis. So we don't read it as ne, one syllable. We read it as nei, two syllables, nei. That brings us to the end of Article 8, and that also brings us to the end of Lesson 2. So in Lesson 2, if we just scroll back to the top, we learned about the vowels of the Greek alphabet. We learned that there are 7 vowels. We learned some are always long, some are always short, some can be short or long. We then talked about diphthongs, what diphthongs are, what are the Greek diphthongs, and why they're special sounds, and what they mean, and how they direct us how to read Greek words. And then we talked about how the different vowel sounds are formed, helping us to think about the linguistics of Greek pronunciation. And then lastly, we learned that sometimes two vowels together that would normally form a diphthong don't, and they're marked by diairesis when they don't. Okay, so that's all the content for Lesson 2. I moved through this quickly because You can always pause the video. You can always re-watch it, back up and watch a part again. So I'm going to try to make these videos as short as possible and as helpful as possible. But that's all for Lesson 2 in the Academy's Greek Grammar course. If you have any questions about this lesson when you study it for your own mastery, post them on the support forum on the course page, and I'll do my best to get answers for you. But that's all for Lesson 2, Articles 4 through 8 in Greek Grammar 1. God bless.